Well, you all will be happy to know that today I reached a new level of adulthood, a new phase of adulthood. And I think it's because I'm getting close to 30. I've now reached the level of fun ruiner. And I was sitting in my office today. Of course, Natalie dropped me off. She does that on Wednesdays. So there's no car in the parking lot on Wednesdays. You notice that we have burn rubber marks in the parking lot. And I was in my office sitting at the desk, and I heard skrrr, like over and over and over again. And suddenly, it was just really loud. I was like, I gotta see what's going on. There's 3 cars out there. They're doing donuts. And I didn't get the information, but I did eventually walk out there, and as one of them was getting ready to do a big burnout, I walked out the side door. I was standing right behind them. I just smiled and waved, and then they all 3 left. I don't know what the deal was, but anyways, so I reached a new level of adulthood today. Hopefully they won't be back because they keep on marking up our parking lot pretty good. But anyways, that was interesting. We're going to be in Mark chapter 1 this evening. If you would turn over to that, please. And we'll go ahead and read and pick up in verse 40. But before we start reading, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful, God, again, to come together, and we're thankful for your church and for all the great things you've accomplished for us, God, that no matter what happens in the world, we can have hope, and we can kind of focus on you and focus on things that are eternal, and realize that the things in this life, so many of them most of them are temporary and aren't going to last. They aren't things that are going to span into eternity, although sometimes we think this life lasts forever. And so it's helpful for us, God, to get together as your children and to redirect our minds towards spiritual things and the things that do last. And we're thankful for your son Jesus, and that we have written accounts of his life from eyewitnesses. And we pray that you can help us follow his example to live like him to the best of our abilities. And help us in our efforts in evangelism. Help us to recognize when we have opportunities to plant seeds, plant your word in people's hearts, and give us the wisdom and the ability to do that effectively. And we ask that you forgive us when we fall short, as we inevitably do. And we thank you for your son Jesus, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in, as I said, Mark chapter 1, and just reviewing before we get into that, we've kind of recapped these every single week, and lessons 1 through 3. I think we've recapped that enough. But we've looked at different scenarios where Jesus interacts with people and kind of from all different walks of life. But if we could put all of them under maybe one category, for the most part, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, a lot of these people are generally outsiders. Whether they're people that had with the woman by the well, she had multiple marriages. She was somebody that would have been looked down on. She was also a woman, which was another thing that would cause people to look down on you. And we see Jesus and how he meets her and where she's at in life, and we glean some from that. But we also talked about Jesus and the messed up, and we think about the demon-possessed man, and we might not come across somebody that has a demon possession, but we do come across people that are wrestling with their demons, and we see Jesus takes that man, and he becomes his first missionary, essentially, as he goes out into the Decapolis and spreads the word. We looked at Jesus and the rich young ruler, and this was somebody that thought he had it figured out, and Jesus kind of challenges him and helps him to see that he's got some blind spots, and particularly his riches, as Jesus tells him that if you want to follow me, sell what you have to the poor, get rid of it all, and come follow me. And he goes away sorrowful. And that one stands out to me because that's the story in the Bible that starts off the best. That's the story in Jesus' life, where you see these different people that he talks to, these different people that he's trying to convince of the gospel. This rich young ruler comes to him and is asking, what can I do to have eternal life? And it ends with him going away sorrowful. That's just kind of interesting to me. But we see how he interacts with them. And we talked about last week, Jesus and the doubting. We look at that father who had the son that had an unclean spirit, and he would have seizures and throw himself into water and into fires, and it would cause him great harm. And And he basically says, if you can, is what he says to Jesus, if you can heal my son, will you do that for me? And Jesus challenges him there and challenges him and gets him to see that he's lacking some faith here. And the man finally confesses and says, I believe, help my unbelief. This evening, I want to look at something. I hope that this title, I'm worried that it's going to be taken the wrong way, that it might be kind of offensive. But I want to start off by saying that I think it's kind of rare, and even looking at some of these examples that I just brought up and reflecting back on previous classes, it's rare that you have people that are really hungry and thirsty for the gospel that have their life like totally together. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that it's rare that you have somebody who's not heard the gospel and all of a sudden just has this desire for spiritual things. A lot of times the people that come in through the doors on a Sunday morning that are visitors, a lot of times the people that express the most interest towards the gospel are people whose lives are a wreck, a lot of times is the case. And those are the people that realize they need something. And so, in my time studying with people, I've come across people that are facing, felony charges. They're realizing their life is going a direction and they need hope. It's hard to have hope when you're facing felony charges that might ruin the rest of your life. We come across people that are struggling with addictions that have, they've tried to overcome and they've had no success in trying to overcome it. They've been in rehab facilities. They've done various different things, and they're just realizing they need to rely on a higher power. They need to rely on Jesus. We've come across people that have abandonment issues and all the different issues that can create in a person's life. Maybe they've been abandoned by a spouse or they've been abandoned by a parent, and we know that people can really be struggling and searching during those times. And we also come across people that have physical ailments, that they're realizing either life is temporary or they're dealing with something physically that makes life really difficult, and they're thinking there's got to be more than this. And I think that when we come across people that are like that, sometimes the best word to describe the way we feel in their presence is uncomfortable. Maybe that last one especially, when people are dealing with something physical, maybe something that even affects their appearance, that can be very uncomfortable and it can be very hard to figure out what we're supposed to do in those moments. But I think we have an example of Jesus dealing with somebody in Mark 1 that certainly in their society would have been unpleasant to be around. This isn't somebody that you would have chosen to be around. In fact, it would have been unlawful for you to come too close into contact with them in that society. And of course, I'm talking about Jesus and the leprous man that he heals here in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. And so let's go ahead and just start off, and I'll go ahead and read that. In Mark 1, starting in verse 40. And it says, "A leper came to him, imploring him and kneeling, said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, 'I will be clean.' And immediately leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer your cleansing, what Moses commanded, for a proof to them.' But he went out and began talking freely about it, and so spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in a desolate place. And people were coming to him from every quarter." All right, I want to start off just by setting the scene here, and I know that these are things that you've probably been taught from grade school when we were taught all these different classes growing up. One of the stories that sticks out, certainly in my mind, is this story with Jesus healing this leprous man. And of course, we always talk about leprosy. And I just kind of want to go over this real quick. When we think about leprosy, we most often think about, at least when the Bible uses that word, we think about Hansen's disease. That's what it's called today, is Hansen's disease. So when we see that word leprosy, our mind it immediately goes to what is commonly known today or referred to in the medical community as Hansen's disease. And what that disease is, it's some of its symptoms at least. You have a numbing and a tingling going on in all of your extremities and your fingers, your hands, and your feet and in your toes. And I think what's really happening, the reason why it tingles and becomes numb, is because your extremities kind of start dying. and your toes and your fingers when you read on, the different descriptions on Google, right? One of the descriptions I read said that your fingers become shorter. Well, that's kind of a polite way or a nice way of putting it. I think what's really going on is your extremities are dying and parts of your fingers start to rot and to fall off, and same thing with your toes. Another thing that would have been grotesque to look at is your nose becomes sunken in. And so certainly people's noses sometimes just fall off altogether, so you can imagine looking at somebody in the eye that is dealing with something like that. Your skin becomes really tough. The most extreme cases, this is something that often doesn't happen overnight. It takes several weeks, several years often. But kind of at the end of the road of it results in blindness, paralysis, and then, of course, death. But if you have an NIV, you'll notice that when you read the Old Testament, you will not read the word leprosy in the NIV. When you read the Old Testament, where your Bible typically would say leprosy, NIV, and I think CSB does this to a large extent as well, they've replaced it with the word skin disease. Does anybody know why they've done that? Anybody want to take a guess at why they've done that? Well, it's because leprosy is really a pretty broad term, at least the way that the original language uses the word. We've taken this word in the Hebrew and we've translated it leprosy, but the word in the Hebrew is really just a pretty broad, they're not exactly sure what's being talked about. So we read about that in Leviticus 13 and Leviticus 14, and we won't read all of that, but you're familiar with those passages. If you're reading like New American Standard, even ESV, it'll say leprosy, leprosy, leprosy. But really what the medical community will tell you is that when you read the symptoms that are being listed in Leviticus 13 and 14, they're not at all similar to what we think of as leprosy, what is actually Hansen's disease. So really these are skin infections, skin diseases. And in the Old Testament, when that was being given, what I read from people that are smarter than me, so take that for what it is that what we think of when we think of leprosy and what I had just described earlier, that hadn't really developed or came on the scene yet. In fact, what we call Hansen's disease probably didn't start until around 300 BC. So certainly it was around the time that Jesus was around, but in the Old Testament that wasn't necessarily the case. And so when you read the word leprosy in your Bibles, really it could, especially in the New Testament, it could be this idea of leprosy that we have where our mind normally goes there. But it's really just a broad skin disease, and we don't really know much more beyond that. I do find Luke's words interesting in his account, and I didn't write the verse down where he talks about it, but he describes it as he had leprosy all over him in this same account that we're reading about Jesus healing this leper. And so that tells me that when you read Leviticus 13 and 14, it talks about people, they might just have a spot. They might have something that's oozing or where the hair is turning white. But when I read Luke and he says that the leprosy, he was full of leprosy. He was full, or leprosy was all over, is what some of your versions say. That tells me that this was more than just he had this infected, weird spot on his body. It tells me that this was something, and Luke, by the way, what was his profession? Yeah, he's a physician, right? And so we take his description very seriously at that. And so that tells me that this isn't just, one spot on his body, but this was something that was going throughout his entire body. And so maybe it is the case that Jesus was looking at somebody that had that, that classic idea and image that we think of when we think of leprosy. But I just kind of wanted to mention that and give some context to that. And so really that word's really broad, but this is what it describes as somebody who has a skin disease. Any skin disease that fits the criteria of Leviticus 13 and 14, this is what their life is like if, after 7 days of being quarantined, they present themselves before the priest. The priest was supposed to look at it and see, okay, is it healed? Is it getting better? And if it wasn't the case, then this is what happened. If it persisted, it said the person who has a case of a serious skin disease. So you have skin diseases and you have serious skin diseases, apparently. But he says, in this case, they are to have their clothes torn, and he's to have his hair hanging loose, and he must cover his mouth and cry out, unclean, unclean, and he will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. So I want to ask, what would it have been like in putting yourself in this person's shoes? And I know that you've probably been asked this question before and had this discussion in classes growing up. But for old time's sake, what would it have been like to be this man, to have a skin disease that's all over your body in first century Israel where they're following these rules? What would that have been like? Shame, right? It would have been humiliating, yep. Why? Why shame, Margaret?
Because nobody wants to live with themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't have to shout yourself unclean.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the Israeli culture, cleanliness is paramount, so there's all sorts of rituals around cleanliness. It is tied to, is there an impurity in your life where there's a sin that causes this? You have something like that.
Yeah, so they're not just seeing a guy that's diseased and they feel sorry for him necessarily. They're thinking, what'd that guy do wrong to get this curse from God, potentially? Yeah, good point. Anybody else?
Psychologically isolating, just gotta be by yourself.
Yep, all alone.
Lockdown.
Yeah, exactly. Quarantine, lockdown. Yep. What else? Yeah, pretty much. Unless you can find other lepers to hang out with, you know. Yeah. Yeah, you do have that occasion where, you know, you have 10 lepers that approach Jesus, and I think that's sometimes what their community was other lepers. That's all you could be around. But, yeah, anybody else have any other thoughts as far as that goes? Yeah, super depressing. For the reasons that John stated, and what Margaret said, that it's this humiliating thing, it's this lonely thing, and so naturally when we're feeling humiliated and lonely, we become depressed. That's just how it works.
Chronic pain.
Yep, painful.
That also drives it also feeds into depression.
Yeah, sitting down, you know, putting clothes on. If you're washing yourself, it probably stings. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're all going to have nightmares now, I guess. When we go home. Anybody else? Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? What? Sorry, one more time. Oh, financially, you mean? Yeah, who's going to hire a leprous man? No, you could just beg. Yeah. No, a good point. I didn't even think about that one. That is a good point. That's true. Yeah, so whenever I think of somebody who's leprous, for some reason I think of somebody that's just like, we see the pictures and how it's illustrated to us, and it's just like, oh, there's just a guy and he's alone. It's like, well, no, these people, they have families. There may be a father, maybe a mother, maybe a son. Maybe they have a business that depends on them, and they're cut off from all of that, no choice. You can imagine how hard that would be if your life just pretty much came to an abrupt stop today, and you have leprosy. You got to go live out on your own in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where that would be in Kansas. How far before we get to the middle of nowhere? I don't know. Yeah, 100 miles. But anyways, you all are nice. But yeah, you got to live out on your own. You can't communicate with anybody. You can't come to worship. They couldn't attend synagogue. All that stuff. That would just be basically a horrible existence. And so, the words that I wrote down that came to my mind when I was thinking about what it would be like to be this guy, I think number one, it would feel hopeless, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be like a totally hopeless existence? And I think the main reason to me why that word comes to mind is because I think it was pretty rare that somebody actually recovered from this disease. There's actually a quote from rabbis that say it was easier to raise somebody from the dead, or maybe it's as hard to raise somebody from the dead as it is to cleanse them of their leprosy. So that's how rare I think it was that somebody was actually cleansed of this. And I think you have Naaman that had a very serious skin disease like this, and maybe it was similar to what we think of in Hansen's disease. But you guys remember Naaman, right, in that story in 2 Kings 5? And it's interesting when they're sending that message to the king, like, hey, Naaman, he's coming, and he has this skin disease, and he heard that you have a prophet there that can heal him of this skin disease. And you'll remember the king's reaction, the king of Israel. It says when he read the letter in 2 Kings 5:7, he tore his clothes and asked, "Am I God, killing and giving life, that this man expects me to cure a man of his skin disease? Recognize that he is only picking a fight with me." So he gets this message that Naaman is expecting to come there and be cleansed, and the king interprets it like, how can he expect that? He's just doing this to stir something up. He's doing this to start a fight, to start a war. That's how unlikely it was that this would happen. And then secondly, the word that came to mind, which was already brought out by John, is that it would be incredibly lonely. I read that lepers were to remain at all times at least 50 steps away from any person that they came in contact with. That's more than 6 feet, I think, as far as social distancing is concerned. I read this, and I think at one point I read it with reference to the first century, but this time I could only come across it in reference to the Middle Ages. But I read that in the Middle Ages, at least, you were expected to walk, if you had leprosy, you're expected to walk downwind from everybody. Why? Why were they? Okay. Yeah, Dan said it because they smelled. And during the Middle Ages, they had this belief that if you smelt something bad, then you were going to get sick. That was a sign that you're going to get sick. So if you protect yourself from smelling bad things, then you won't get sick. And so fortunately, that's not necessarily the case anymore, so we can all hang out with Andy and... Sorry, I can pass that up. But that's what they believed back then. And I think it does give a picture, though, in all seriousness, that if your skin is rotting, you have this disease, you know what? You're getting all the 5 senses here, I guess you could say, other than taste, certainly. But you think about how it would look, but also how it would smell, right? That's somebody's rotting flesh. You can certainly imagine that they probably wouldn't smell good either. And then lastly, Margaret brought this one out as far as what it reminded me of. It was a humiliating predicament, wasn't it? It was a humiliating thing to have leprosy, that when you go out, every time you go out in public, it's not just how you're presenting yourself, right? So you have these torn, ratty clothes. Your hair is totally disheveled. They're hanging off your body, and then on top of that, you have to cover your mouth, and you have to proclaim, unclean, unclean. And so it's bad enough that you have this disease. If you had this disease, it seems to me the way that I would go about dealing with it is I would hide from people at all costs. Well, it's hard to hide when the law expects you to declare yourself publicly as you come anywhere near people. When you come within eyeshot of people, you have to declare yourself that you are unclean, that you have leprosy. And so I do remember as a kid being taught this by my teacher, and he picked me to be the one pretending to have leprosy. And I had to declare myself unclean, unclean for the whole class. But anyways, that's what they had to do. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when we read about this man and how he approaches Jesus, how would you describe his attitude just from this verse? It says that the man with leprosy came to him and on his knees begged him, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." What's his attitude? What's his disposition? Hopeful, yeah. Maybe the first time he's felt hope in a while. Humble, yeah. I read desperation, too. I mean, he comes up to Jesus, and when you read Matthew's account, it's kind of interesting because in Matthew, this story takes place in Matthew chapter 8. And so what just happened in Matthew 5, 6, and 7? Sermon on the Mount, right? And it says that when Jesus came down from the mount, it says like immediately this guy came up to him. So once he's done teaching, that's just kind of interesting to me. And so I see a sense of urgency there. I see somebody that is just ready to completely humble himself. I see somebody who's absolutely desperate. He's not just on his knees, but he's begging him. And I think you also see somebody that has a tremendous amount of faith in him already. What tells us that he has a certain level of faith already? What is it about what he says that indicates faith? Yeah, so he seems to have this belief unlike the father of the demon-possessed child or young man, that guy said, if you can. This guy says, if you're willing. So it's not a question of whether or not he has the power to. It's a question of whether or not he wants to, whether or not he's willing to. Now, those are probably the two things we struggle with when we think about God and when we think about doubt the most. I think a lot of us move beyond the doubting his existence, doubting his capabilities. But we often struggle with his willingness. And sometimes that's because we pray for something and he does answer with a no. And sometimes he answers with a not yet. But we can relate to him in this case, approaching Jesus and saying, if you're willing. And of course, Jesus says he is. So the question that I always like to ask when we're looking at this and looking at these different people and from different walks of life is, who might this man kind of remind you of? What are the types of people that this man might remind you of that maybe we might come across? What are some things about him that remind us of certain people we might interact with? Yeah. Yeah, no. I don't think we're coming across anybody with leprosy, yeah. Cancer, okay. Yeah, sometimes cancer, it changes your appearance. When people's eyebrows fall off and their hair falls off from chemotherapy, that can be uncomfortable, and it can be easy to withdraw ourselves from people that are going through something hard like that. Who else? Homeless, yeah. It does kind of evoke that image for sure, especially when you talk about somebody that has torn clothes and messed up hair. Yeah. What were you saying, Margaret? Yeah, and it's kind of almost a natural thing when we see somebody that looks different than what we're used to seeing a human being look like. It kind of makes us uncomfortable. And I don't mean that mean, and maybe I'm revealing something about myself that I shouldn't reveal, but I think that we all have had that experience where we see somebody walk into a room, or we walk into a room, and we're surprised by what somebody looks like. And it's hard to handle those situations. I guess a few things that I was thinking of was like, here's somebody that, this leper, he's not really capable of taking care of himself. He doesn't have the money, as Ronnie said. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. He's outcast. He's out there alone. He's not just separated from, his family, but he's told to live outside the camp. So he's not even allowed to be in the city. So he's not able to take care of himself. I think sometimes it's uncomfortable when you go and visit somebody that's in the later stages of life. Sometimes we kind of want to withdraw from somebody in that predicament because it's uncomfortable. I remember visiting my grandfather in the last 2 weeks of his life, and it was uncomfortable to be around somebody that could no longer, somebody you respected that can no longer use the restroom, that can no longer take care of themselves and in the basic ways. But we see people sometimes get to those points, or maybe not to that extreme, before they reach that older age, and it's just uncomfortable to be around people like that. I think this guy makes me think of different lifestyles that when we see them, they evoke the word unclean, right? So sometimes we see and walk into somebody's home and it's totally unkept. And it's just kind of uncomfortable being there. They have unkept hair, unkept clothes. I can think on several occasions, one in particular when I was in Salem, going over to an older widow's house. And I really hadn't met her yet because when I started at Salem, she didn't attend all that often anyways. And then COVID happened, so she definitely didn't visit. And so I went with Jack Hafer to visit this older widow. And she lived like in a mobile home, and you walked into her house, and it wasn't very clean. There's food sitting out, milk cartons. But she was kind of just at this point where she wasn't capable of doing the things that we're able to, or maybe wasn't aware of how bad things were. It can be really easy to say, never stepping foot in that place again. But those are the people that need socializing. Those are the people that need friendship, that need somebody to recognize them and to acknowledge them. And I can say, man, she was very sociable. She was very happy to see us on that day. Sometimes I've met several people throughout my times being a preacher, and as we all have met different people, people have overcome drug addictions. They've done drugs for the first 20, 30 years of their life. That leaves physical reminders of that. I know some people that, their teeth are rotted, and you stand too close to them and you can smell their breath. And it's very, if I could use the word unpleasant, it's uncomfortable. And again, our instinct is to withdraw from people like that. And these aren't reasons that have anything to do with their personality, that have anything to do with their current character traits, but they're things that just make us uncomfortable, things that have to do with appearances. And then what was already mentioned, Margaret kind of hit on this, just reminds me of anybody that has a disease that alters or affects their physical appearance. We've kind of covered that already. And so again, if we're being honest, we come across people, is the point, that just make us uncomfortable. And I think that that's what this leper was. This wasn't somebody that is even anything probably close to how this picture depicts him, where it's just like, he's just an actor with a pretty decent beard, actually. Looks like he trimmed it not too long ago. This is somebody that would have been hard to look at. You would have smelled him coming. Somebody that nobody else wanted anything to do with, and yet he feels comfortable coming up to Jesus, and Jesus certainly doesn't turn him away. Anyways, so those are some things that this guy kind of reminded me of, where maybe we might come across somebody that just makes us uncomfortable, and I think that we see in Jesus maybe some ideas of how to deal with that, because it can be very easy just to detach, to avoid, to not have anything to do with them. So what does Jesus do? Of course, he heals him. That's the part we can't do. But it says in verse 41 that he was moved with compassion, and Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. He said, "I'm willing." And he told him, "Be made clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And then he sternly warned him and sent him away at once, telling him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." So what are some things here? Of course, we can't cleanse people. We can't cause somebody's cancer to go away. Those are the things we can't do, but there are some little things Jesus does here that we can do. So what are the things that Jesus does that we can do? Touched him. Yep. Yep, had compassion. Anybody else? Pray. Yeah, we can pray. Yep.
I did have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In mine it said Jesus was the indignant, but if Jesus was doing things since filled with compassion.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because I actually sometimes I like to share books with you guys. So this was a book that when I was being taught some original languages, the guy told me, he said, go and get this, because you'll find that, there's textual variants. I think we're all familiar with the textual variant when in the Greek text, certain manuscripts have a certain word, but then for whatever reason, there's some other manuscripts that have a different Greek word. That happens time to time, and those are called textual variants. And so there is a textual variant here where a lot of your versions will say that Jesus had compassion, but there is a manuscript from the 5th century that's a pretty important one, and basically the word that it has there is what would be translated as angry or indignant. A lot of people kind of dismiss that and say, well, it doesn't really seem to make sense, but sometimes the difficulty, when you read something, the difficulty of it and how we kind of struggle to see why it makes sense, that sometimes is an indication that it's original, because a lot of times if something doesn't make sense or is hard for us to interpret, then people would kind of say, well, that word doesn't really make sense, let's use this word instead. Does that make sense? I probably didn't explain that very well. But what I want to say is that there's not actually consensus on this, and what this book does is it goes through every major textual variant in the New Testament, and it'll explain you the thought process of why they chose to go with this word instead of that word, if that makes sense. And on this verse, in Mark 1 and verse 41, I'll just read the first sentence. He says, "It's difficult to come to a firm decision concerning the original text." And he gives arguments for both, but he ends up leaning towards the compassion one. But it is interesting that he feels, one version says this compassion, which that Greek word is, it's the root word splanchna, refers to the bowels, right? It's this deep emotion that Jesus has when he looks at this man. And that word strikes me because when I come across somebody that's like this leper, a lot of times I'm thinking about how it makes me feel, right? And how uncomfortable I am. And what do I say? Where do I look? I think when Jesus looks at this guy, he just has compassion towards him. He looks at his suffering, and he's thinking about how it makes him feel. So sometimes, when I was growing up, I think we all have features and things about us that nobody really notices or cares about, but we think about them and we're self-conscious. So when I was growing up, everybody made fun of me because I had big ears. They'd say, how many channels do you get with those things? Like they're satellites or antennas. And I kind of grew out of it. I know that I'm going to be told, no, you didn't, Sam. But I think that was kids, right, that were teasing me. Most adults would look at me, they wouldn't notice. But since I had a few kids tease me about it, how self-conscious was I as a young 13, 14-year-old about my ears and how big they were? And I was worried I wouldn't wear hats because I felt like they pressed my ears out, and nobody else was thinking about it, but I was. And I was very sensitive about it. And we all have things that are like that. I think sometimes we're tempted to deal with, a person like this leper, like we don't notice what's going on, and we don't think about it from their point of view. He knows he has leprosy. How do you think it makes them feel? And I think sometimes we're kind of selfish, at least certainly I am, in uncomfortable situations and thinking about how uncomfortable I am, and again, where do I look, where do I stare, that kind of a thing. So he possibly feels this sympathy. I think he certainly does feel sympathy, whether or not that's the original word. I think that you see that in Jesus' actions. But if the word is angry or indignant, let's just kind of entertain that for a moment. If that is the original language here, what is he angry? What is he indignant about? Maybe, yeah, that could be it. That's one possibility. Yeah. Go ahead, Becky. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting the word that it uses, you'll notice your Bible states something like he sternly sent him away, right? Or he sternly warned him, I think is what it says. So maybe there's something going on there. Any other thoughts? And I wonder, go ahead. That's okay.
Their interpretation was perhaps it's Jesus expressing anger towards sin as a byproduct, and here we have leprosy, all this nastiness would not be in the world without sin.
Yeah, and that's maybe one thought that I had as well. I cheat too. It's just I do it before class starts, so that's okay. I'm glad that you're reading. And Jesus actually has a similar set of emotions when he looks around at all the people that are weeping around Lazarus' tomb. Like the word that it used there was the same word that's here, that he's indignant. It's the word that was used to describe the snorting of a horse. And it's like a lot of interpretations are that Jesus is upset and frustrated at what caused Lazarus to be in the tomb, what caused this person to have leprosy, which is what? It's sin. Not necessarily his personal sin, but it's sin in the world, that we had it good in the Garden of Eden, at least Adam and Eve did. And they opened up Pandora's box of sin, and here comes all this death and disease. And so we look at these physical challenges that people face, and we know it all goes back and can be traced back to sin, to the spiritual problem. And so those are kind of two different ideas. I appreciate your input there. But in either case, I just want to emphasize that Jesus felt something towards this guy. Whether it was he's upset about the spiritual problems in this world and what led to this man being here, whether it was feeling compassion towards him, he felt something towards this guy when he's on his knees before him. The other thing I want to bring out is that Jesus listened to him, didn't he? And I think that's sometimes the first step in dealing with somebody that's uncomfortable, that has features or is just uncomfortable to be around, is listening to their story, listening to what they have to say, treating them like a human being. That's what Jesus does. And I think that we see that most notably, and Judy already said that, when he touches him, right? How long do you think it's been since this guy had been touched? We really have no idea. How long had he had leprosy? That's how long it had been since he'd been touched. And Jesus, he didn't have to do that, right? He could have just cleansed him with the word. He causes people to, he caused Lazarus to come out of the tomb, right? Lazarus, come on out. Get out here. And there's Lazarus. But Jesus doesn't say, just be cleansed. He does do that, but he touches him first. And so why? Why does he touch him?
He lets an example.
Okay.
He's also a sign
Comfort, yeah. What else? Yeah, I don't know there's like an exact right answer, but I think part of it is he's treating this guy like he's human. Here's a guy who has been untouched. Josephus has a quote where he talks about the way you treat lepers and the way that lepers are dealt with and the way that a dead body is dealt with. He said in that context, he says there's really no difference between a dead body and a leprous person. So adds color to what it would have been like to be this guy. You're this walking dead man, this walking zombie. And Jesus, he touches him. Of course, he doesn't just touch him to comfort him. He touches him with a healing touch. So again, I think that the bottom line to me is when we're dealing with people that are uncomfortable, it's easy for me to withdraw from them. It's easy for me to overthink things. I think the key is just treating them like they're human, acknowledging them, showing them that they're valuable when we're in those situations. There was a kid that we grew up with in middle school, and he smelt really bad. I'm not saying this to be funny, but he smelt really bad. And I remember it's about 6th or 7th grade, and every time we would have PE, we'd start off by running around the gym, and we'd do several laps. And he smelled so bad that he would be running by himself, and we would every other kid would be clustered together running away from him because he smelled that bad. And I look back on that, here's a 13, 14-year-old kid. What do you think are the reasons as to why he smelled bad? It was more than that. What was his home life like? What was it about his home situation that his parents were letting him go out of the house and that's how he smelt, right? And you start thinking about this and you start thinking, how did that make them feel that all these kids would run away from him? And you realize what he really needed was probably a friend, somebody that would listen to him, somebody that would talk to him. And I know that we're not in middle school anymore. We grow up and we aren't mean to people like that, but we politely avoid them, don't we? Isn't that sometimes what we do? We're not outspoken about it like middle schoolers. They're all clustering together, running away. But we politely avoid people, don't we? Because of physical appearance, not because of their character, not because they're dangerous to us, but because they make us uncomfortable. We don't know what we would say, where we would look, or what we would do. I think people just need to be treated like human, right? And I know you all know this. These are just simple things. But speaking to them, joking with them, making eye contact with them, shaking their hand, because those are the people that are desperate for it. Anyways, they're all coming out now. That's my sign. The door's open there, and they're walking out. But I think one thing that we should remember, I want us to see that he went out and he began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news. It's interesting that was an act of disobedience. Jesus told him, don't say a word, and he goes out and he can't help but proclaim it. And I look at me, and I'm commanded to go preach it, and yet sometimes I don't. I think that contrast is interesting. But I think one thing to leave us with here is that when we're looking at what makes us uncomfortable about other people and things that are unpleasant about maybe their appearance or how they look or whatever it might be, how unpleasant are we in the eyes of God? Isn't that the situation that we're all in spiritually? And so just being mindful of that and recognizing, okay, this is how I see them, but how does God see me? And what extent did God go to in order to have a relationship with me and to draw near to me? Anyway, so that's Jesus dealing with this leprous person. Anybody else have any comments or thoughts before we wrap up? Ava, you got any comments or thoughts? No? All right. Layla, comments or thoughts? No. All right, thanks. Thanks for your comments.